Have you ever heard of a man who married the love of his life, only to find out she gave birth to him 28 years earlier? This isn't fiction. This isn't a twisted movie. This is a real story, buried in an adoption file, sealed for decades, until a DNA test tore a perfect family in half. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? And if you're new here, subscribe, because some secrets should never stay buried. In the faded heart of rural Ohio, where the winters bite through wooden-clapboard houses and the smell of coal lingers in the air, there once stood a town so quiet it felt suspended in time. The year was 1993, long before cell phones and social media, when secrets could be buried in the seams of a community for decades. On the edge of this town lived a shy, doe-eyed girl named Lydia Moore. She was just 17, the kind of teenager who kept her head down at the bus stop, who never spoke above a whisper in church, who spent more time sketching in her notebooks than talking to her classmates. Her father was a deacon at the only church in town, her mother a seamstress who sewed hymnal covers for the parish. To outsiders, they looked like a good, upright family. But inside their small, drafty house, silence was a weapon. Every word spoken was measured, every expression scrutinized. Lydia's life might have passed in complete obscurity, if not for a summer evening that would leave a scar across her entire future. At a county fair, lit by flickering bulbs strung above the cracked asphalt, she met a boy named Daniel. Older, already out of school, the son of a traveling contractor. He was not a bad man. He was just lost, restless, drifting through jobs and towns like a paper boat on dark water. For Lydia, who had never been anywhere but her town, Daniel's attention felt like sunlight after a long winter. They met in secret for weeks. There were no love letters, no grand gestures, just quiet conversations in his truck by the old mill road, the smell of cut hay in the air, the windows rolled down. By September, Lydia knew she was pregnant. She told no one for months, hiding the growing truth under oversized sweaters, but small towns have sharp eyes. One Sunday after church, her mother pressed her hand too hard against Lydia's shoulder and asked, through clenched teeth, "Is there something you need to tell us?" That night, the house erupted. Her father's voice was low, furious, quoting scripture between breaths. The word shame hung in the kitchen like a fog. Within a week, arrangements were made. Lydia would finish school quietly, and when the baby came, it would be handled. In the language of that town, handled meant erased, silenced, forgotten. The months that followed were a blur of isolation. She was sent to stay with an aunt she barely knew in a neighboring county, far from classmates, far from Daniel, far from anyone who might have asked questions. The aunt's house was clean but cold, with lace curtains that smelled of mothballs, and an old clock that ticked so loudly Lydia would press her palms over her ears at night. She carried her child in silence, feeling it kick beneath her ribs, while the adults around her spoke as if it were already gone. Sometimes she would lie awake and imagine a different life, one where she and Daniel were together, where the baby had a name and a room with sunlight and toys, where no one treated it as a stain on her soul. On a grey February morning, before the first snow melted, Lydia went into labour. The hospital room was stark and impersonal, staffed by a nurse who would not meet her eyes. Daniel was not there, her parents were not there, only the aunt, perched stiffly in a corner chair, clutching a rosary. When the baby's cries filled the room, Lydia felt an almost supernatural pull, an urge to hold, to breathe in the scent of new life, to whisper a name she had chosen in secret. But the baby was taken before she could even see his face clearly. A nurse announced briskly that arrangements have been made, and walked out with the swaddled bundle as if it were an envelope. Lydia's arms ached with emptiness. 2 days later she was discharged. There was no mention of paperwork, no birth certificate handed to her. It was as if the child had evaporated, like morning mist on the fields. She returned to her parents' house in the dead of night. No one spoke of it again. The town never asked questions. Daniel moved on with his life. Lydia tried to. But in quiet moments, folding laundry, sitting in the pew, driving down empty roads, she would feel a phantom weight in her arms and wonder, boy or girl? Did it have her eyes or Daniel's? Was it warm? Did someone hold it kindly? By the time she turned 20, Lydia left that town entirely. She moved states away, changed jobs often, and never once told anyone about the baby. Friends described her as soft-spoken, always helpful, but with an air of sadness that clung to her like perfume. Decades would pass before the past caught up with her. But in that winter of 1993, as she walked out of the hospital with nothing but a paper bag of personal belongings, Lydia believed she had buried her secret forever. It was nearly 3 decades later when Lydia met him, on a day that felt like any other. She was 45 then, living alone in a modest rental outside of Lafayette, Indiana, in a neighborhood where most of the houses had peeling paint and porch swings that creaked when the wind blew. By that time, she worked at a community food pantry 3 days a week, helping pack boxes for the elderly and low-income families who trickled in with quiet desperation. Her life had shrunk to a routine: tea at 6, bed by 10, soft gospel on the radio, and a silence that had grown so familiar she barely noticed it anymore. She didn't talk about her past, not to her co-workers, not to her neighbors, not even to herself. The years had worn her gently, like a river smoothing a stone. Her hair, once chestnut, was threaded with grey. Her hands bore the faint calluses of labor. People often described her as kind but distant. She offered compassion freely, but when it came to her own life, she kept the doors closed. His name was Michael. He was 27, tall but unassuming, with soft features and the kind of voice that didn't interrupt. He'd recently moved into town after the sudden death of his adoptive parents in a highway crash outside of Bloomington. He arrived with little more than a toolbox, a box of old photographs, and a faded Bible with no name on the front page. He told people he was starting over, and no one questioned it, not in a place where everyone was too busy with their own shadows. They met during one of the Saturday community drives, where Lydia had been sorting canned goods, while Michael unloaded fresh produce from the back of a borrowed pickup truck. It wasn't romantic. There were no sparks, no movie magic music in the background. Just 2 people exchanging soft glances in the middle of cardboard boxes and wilted carrots. What stood out later was how easy it had been to talk to him, how unforced everything felt. Michael was quiet, but not withdrawn. He told her he'd grown up in foster care, mostly in the north of Illinois, shuffled from home to home until he was adopted at 8. His parents, he said, were simple, loving people. They owned a small upholstery business. They never told him much about his biological family, just that he'd been a surprise at a hospital in Ohio. Lydia, hearing this, felt a pinprick at the edge of her thoughts, but quickly brushed it aside. It was a big country. A lot of babies were born in Ohio. It didn't mean anything. Over time, their conversations lengthened. He started staying after the food drives to help her clean. Then he began walking her to her car. One evening, when her tire was flat, he changed it without a word and left a pack of batteries in her glove box because he'd noticed her flashlight was dying. These weren't grand gestures, just small, unnoticed kindnesses that began to stitch themselves into her daily life. Lydia hadn't let anyone in for decades, but Michael wasn't like other people. He didn't press. He didn't try to fix her. He simply stood there beside her until the silence between them didn't feel lonely anymore. By the following spring, they began to see each other outside of the pantry. They'd meet at the same bench by the river on Sundays, sharing coffee from paper cups and watching the water move. Michael talked about maybe starting his own electrical repair business. Lydia offered to help him design the flyers. One afternoon, he brought her a framed photo of a newborn baby and said, "That was me, found it in my mom's old dresser." Lydia stared at it for a long time. The hospital wristband was blurry. The date was visible, February 1993. Her hands trembled slightly, but she smiled. "You were beautiful," she whispered. Neither of them said the obvious, not then. The bond they shared didn't feel like obsession or infatuation. It was deeper, quieter. It was the kind of connection that felt earned, like something built brick by brick after a storm had passed. When Michael proposed, it wasn't with fireworks or fanfare. He simply looked at her one night as they sat watching the rain and said, "I don't want another day where you're not mine." Lydia, who had spent her life building walls, felt something inside her finally give. She nodded, tears silent on her cheeks. They were married in a small backyard ceremony in July. Just a few friends. A borrowed arch of plastic roses. Lydia wore a pale blue dress. Michael wore his father's old suit. Their vows were simple. "You're the first place that's ever felt like home," she said. No one questioned the age gap. No one cared about the gaps in their histories. In a town full of wounded people, their love looked like healing. They bought a small fixer-upper on the edge of town, painted the porch together, planted tomatoes, talked about children. For once, Lydia began to imagine a future she hadn't dared to hope for. It would take 2 years and 1 hospital visit for that dream to crack wide open. The first time Lydia felt the child move inside her, she was washing dishes. The kitchen window was open, and wind brushed against the lace curtains like a whisper from another world. She stood still, her hands submerged in the lukewarm water, listening to the birdsong outside and the faint creak of floorboards upstairs. Then the flutter, a ripple deep in her belly, like a pebble dropped in still water. She froze. After all those years, this was real. She wasn't imagining it. She was 48. The doctor had called it a geriatric pregnancy, a term that made her feel like an old tree with one last bloom left. They had tried for over a year. Michael had always said he would be content either way, with or without children. But Lydia knew he wanted a family, not in the possessive way most men did. He never said things like, "my legacy" or "our bloodline." He just talked about late-night lullabies, Sunday pancakes, and the idea of creating something together that was part joy, part forgiveness. The pregnancy progressed slowly, carefully. She was high risk from the start. Every visit to the clinic was filled with uncertainty. The doctors asked questions about family history, but Lydia offered very little. She claimed her parents had died years ago, that she was an only child, that most of her family records had been lost in a house fire, a lie that had become so practiced it felt like truth. She never mentioned the baby she had lost as a teen, never admitted that she sometimes heard phantom cries in her sleep or felt the ghost of tiny fingers curl around hers in dreams. Michael was everything she had never known in a man, gentle, patient, attentive. He read books about prenatal nutrition. He rubbed her ankles when they swelled. He painted the nursery in soft yellows and bought a rocking chair from a second-hand shop, fixing its creak with a drop of oil. When she'd wake up anxious, convinced something was wrong, he'd place her hand over his heart and whisper, "Still here, still safe." And when the baby came, screaming, wrinkled, perfect, it was as if the entire world paused. The delivery was long, almost 36 hours, and at one point they thought they might lose her. But Lydia, as she always had, pushed through the pain without complaint. She held her son in trembling arms and whispered, "You're not going anywhere." They named him Elias, a quiet name, a name with roots. For the first 3 months, everything felt like a dream, their home filled with the soft sound of lullabies and the rustle of tiny blankets. Lydia couldn't stop watching him, tracing the curve of his nose, the dimples in his cheeks, the way his fingers curled around hers exactly the way she used to imagine when she was 17. But soon, things began to shift. At 6 weeks, Elias wasn't responding to light the way he should. His eyes moved, but not always in sync. At 8 weeks, he cried too often. not the usual hunger wails, but something deeper, more distressed. At 3 months, he had his first seizure. Doctors ran tests, scans, blood work. They found abnormalities, patterns in his chromosomes that suggested a rare recessive disorder, something inherited. "It's not fatal," the pediatrician said gently, "but we need more information. We need both parents to do a genetic panel to understand how this passed down." Michael agreed immediately. He had no idea about his biological parents, and he'd always been curious. "Maybe this will tell me something I never knew," he told Lydia with a half-smile, holding her hand. Lydia hesitated for a long time, but in the end she couldn't say no. Not with Elias so fragile. They both submitted their samples. Cheek swabs, quick and painless. The nurse said the results would come back in a few weeks. Those weeks were strange, tense, not visibly, but somewhere underneath the surface. Michael grew more thoughtful. He started looking through his old adoption papers, pulling out bits of information he'd never cared about before. Lydia watched him quietly, hoping it would pass, hoping the results would come and go like wind through curtains. But on the 14th day, a letter came in the mail. A white envelope from the genetics lab. Lydia found it first. She held it for nearly an hour before opening it. She read it once, then again. The words didn't change. There, in crisp clinical language, it was written clearly. Subject A and Subject B share a 99.9% maternal DNA match. Relationship: mother and biological son. The room tilted. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. The envelope slid from her lap and landed on the floor like a verdict. Outside, the world continued. Birds chirped, neighbors walked their dogs, the wind rustled through the leaves. But inside that house, something had cracked open that could never be closed again. Lydia placed the envelope back on the table, carefully folded along the original crease, and stared at it for hours. Not because she didn't believe it, but because she did. Because somewhere, buried beneath 28 years of silence, she already knew. She had known since the day she saw that photograph of his newborn face and heard him say, "That was me." She had known it in the way her body recoiled and calmed at the same time whenever he touched her. She had known it in her bones. But truth, when finally laid bare on paper, still has the power to annihilate. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. For the first time in years, Lydia began waking in the middle of the night, gasping for air. She'd sit at the edge of the bed, staring at the crib, listening to Elias's soft breaths. Michael slept beside her, arm curled over a pillow, face at peace. A man who still believed he was loved. She wanted to run, to disappear before he read it. But she couldn't leave the child, not again. The next morning, she called in sick to the food pantry and took Elias for a walk down the river trail. She didn't take her phone, didn't speak to anyone, just walked slowly, hour after hour, trying to memorize every sound of the outside world before it changed forever. When she returned home, Michael was sitting at the table. The envelope was in front of him. Open. Read. He didn't speak, not at first. His hands were clenched into fists so tight that the skin had turned white. He looked like a man who had seen a car coming for miles and still couldn't move out of the way. Lydia stood in the doorway, her arms around the child, her face wet from tears she hadn't noticed falling. "It has to be a mistake," he finally said, but the words didn't even reach the end of the sentence. Lydia opened her mouth, but no sound came. What could she say? That she hadn't known, that she hadn't meant for this to happen, that she had buried a truth so deep inside herself that even she forgot how to dig it out. That this wasn't love born from perversion. It was loneliness meeting loneliness in the only language it understood. He stood up, stared at her. "You're my mother?" he asked. Not with rage, but with the kind of raw, gutted disbelief that comes only once in a lifetime, when something foundational collapses and takes everything with it. She nodded, slowly, carefully, as if each movement had the power to split the air. Michael stepped backward, his heel hitting the leg of a chair, nearly stumbling. He didn't look at the child, didn't touch her, just walked out the front door and disappeared into the night. He didn't come home that night, or the next. Lydia told no one. She didn't report him missing. She didn't call friends. She sat in the rocking chair beside Elias's crib and waited. She played soft music on the old CD player, the same lullabies Michael had chosen. She fed the baby, changed him, whispered stories that made no sense. She stared at the photograph of their wedding on the mantel, two smiling faces who had no idea they were ghosts of the same tragedy. When Michael returned 3 days later, he looked like he hadn't slept. His eyes were sunken, his face pale, his jaw tight. He stood in the doorway for a long time before walking in. Lydia didn't move. "I've been to the adoption agency," he said. His voice was low, mechanical. "The records match. Same hospital, same dates, same last name listed before it was blacked out." Lydia nodded. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't know," she whispered. "Not at first. Not when we met. Not until the photograph. And by then—" She stopped. The rest was too broken to speak aloud. Michael sat down slowly, like someone whose bones were dissolving inside him. His hands trembled. "I loved you," he said. "I still love you," she replied. He shook his head violently, as if the words could be thrown off like insects. "You were my wife, and now you're my mother. And now we have a child who's both. I don't even know what he is." Lydia stood. She reached for Elias, sleeping in the bassinet. "He's a child, that's all. He's just a child." But Michael couldn't look at him, couldn't hold him, couldn't see him without seeing the breach of nature and fate. They sat in silence until the sun rose. And when morning came, Michael packed a small bag, kissed the baby's forehead once, lightly, like a stranger, and left. This time Lydia knew he wouldn't come back. Years later, when the house had fallen silent and the garden was wild again, a postal worker found a sealed envelope addressed simply to the Records Department, St. Mary's Hospital, Ohio. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated in faded blue ink. The handwriting was delicate but shaky, the kind of script that belongs to a woman who had run out of both strength and time. It was signed Lydia Moore. By then, most people in Lafayette had forgotten her name. She was just the quiet woman who'd lived at the end of Birchwood Lane, the one with the peeling blue porch and the overgrown roses, the one who never answered the door but whose light still flickered on every evening at exactly 7. After Michael left, Lydia never remarried. She never moved away. For a while, she told the neighbors he was working out of state, that he'd come home soon, but as months passed and no one saw him again, the story wilted. Rumors filled the gaps. Some said he'd died in an accident. Others whispered that she'd driven him away. Lydia never corrected them. Elias grew into a solemn boy, fragile but kind. He had Michael's eyes and Lydia's quietness. He spent his days drawing, reading, sitting under the maple tree by the fence, talking to no one. The doctors said his condition would make life difficult, but Lydia was determined to give him a childhood untouched by the past. She homeschooled him, taught him letters, songs, small bits of the world. She never told him the truth, not about who his father was, not about how he came to be. To him, she was simply mother, and that was enough. But there were moments when he would ask, "Where's Dad?" And Lydia would freeze mid-sentence, eyes distant, as if searching for the right version of reality to hand him. Sometimes she'd say he was far away. Other times she'd just whisper, "He loved you very much," and change the subject. The years passed like that, slow, quiet, tender. Elias turned 7, then 10, then 13. Lydia's hair turned fully grey. Her hands trembled more each year. She still worked part-time at the pantry until her health began to fade. The house grew lonelier. Dust gathered on the mantel where their wedding photograph still stood, though she had turned it face down long ago. One winter night, a storm rolled over Lafayette. The power went out. Lydia lit a candle and sat in the old rocking chair beside the window. Elias was asleep upstairs. The wind pressed against the house like something alive. She reached into the drawer and took out that letter, the one she had rewritten over and over again for nearly a decade. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't an apology. It was a record, the only version of truth she could leave behind before the silence took her completely. It began simply, "To whom it may concern, my name is Lydia Moore. In February 1993, I gave birth at St. Mary's Hospital in Ohio. I was 17. The child was taken for adoption before I could hold him. I was told he would have a better life. His name was never recorded. 28 years later, that child found me. Neither of us knew who the other was. Life brought us together in the cruelest, kindest way possible. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect understanding. I only ask that someone, someday, knows it happened. That it was real. That it wasn't sin or sickness that tied us. It was loneliness and the failure of everyone who should have protected us both. If there is a record of that adoption, please update it. Let it show that a mother did not forget. She only never knew how to remember. The letter ended there, unsigned beyond her name. No address, no phone number. Just a single folded photograph tucked inside. Lydia, Michael, and baby Elias, taken on their porch the day before the test results arrived. When the postal worker found her weeks later, she was still in that chair, candle burnt to wax, her face calm. Elias was safe, sent to live with a distant cousin. The letter was never returned. But at St. Mary's Hospital, in a filing cabinet deep in the basement, the note was eventually added to an old manila folder stamped Adoption Case 2347B, Infant Male, February 1993. On the inside cover, in small handwriting, someone wrote, "Located, mother deceased, case closed." No one knew the story behind those words, not the years of silence, nor the quiet love that defied the laws of blood and fate. But somewhere in a forgotten record room, the paper still sits, yellowed by time, carrying the last whisper of a secret that was never meant to be found.